Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode. We're going to be talking all about regenerative farming today, and we have touched on this in a prior episode, I think last year or maybe the year before. But I'm always interested when there's research and sitting behind what we're going to talk about. And in fact, that's a big chunk of what we're going to talk about today. So firstly, I want to welcome Heidi Diestal and Kristine Root from Diestal Family Ranch and Regenefied, and we're going to understand a bit more about that dynamic a bit later on. So firstly, both welcome to the show. I kind of want you to introduce yourselves individually, but I'm also curious, I've got some follow-on questions about kind of how you guys became to be working on these respective problems. So maybe Heidi, to start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here and chatting with you guys. I'm a fourth generation turkey farmer based in California in the United States. And, I grew up in the farming world, and my parents helped set standards in the United States for certified organic. And, as we kind of got into our family-owned business, we really wanted to dig deeper into the world of regenerative and push our farming forward in this way. So, yeah, a little bit about me, a little bit of my story.
Wonderful. And Kristine?
Sure. Well, I'm based in Denver, Colorado, and that's where I work as a chief marketing officer for a company called Regenefied. And we're a certification that helps really measure the positive impact that regenerative farms are having, both on ecosystems and then also on the health of our food system.
Wonderful. Okay, cool. We're going to find out about the interplay of those later. I do have a follow-up question for you, Heidi. I kind of want to know what it was like growing up on or around a turkey farm. And I mean that kind of in the literal fun, tell me some quirky story sense, but I also am interested in it insofar as how it's kind of shaped your views and your choices earlier on.
Yeah. Oh, it was massive. I mean, it was so formative. And I don't think I really realized how impactful living on a working farm really was until I tried to leave town and go do something entirely different in an entirely different career. And I just realized how special it was. Yeah. I mean, you're surrounded by food. It's fundamentally it's in your system. It's a way of living. It's a way of looking at the world every day. It's very cyclical in nature, right? Because nature is cyclical. So yeah, I mean, it kind of forms, it's a big part of who I am and very proud to be so.
And on the quirky side, was there any weird things that happened on the turkey farm that are worth sharing or you'd like to share?
I mean, I don't know. How much time do you have? There's always crazy things. I mean, we did a lot of building and construction of barns, right? When I was a kid. And there was one day my dad picked me up from school and, he had a turkey box on the floorboard of the pickup, and the pickup was just a single cab, and it started moving on our way to the hardware store before we went home. And I was like, Dad, why is the turkey box moving? Because it was a box where, product would go, not live animals. And he said, Heidi, open it up and find out. And I did. And it wasn't turkeys. It was actually a batch of kittens. They had run into some, a cat and kittens, and he brought one. And that was my first cat. I was like, wow, this is incredible. So, there's a quirky kind of related topic.
Yeah. I mean, look, I kind of imagine the dynamic on a farm requires people to be much closer to each other on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
And in some respects, and I'm obviously projecting and maybe misunderstanding, but you're not in a city environment where you can easily get away from that. You kind of have to be in that, and that becomes your reality, right?
Oh, completely. And also, when something happens, right, you have a storm or, something goes wrong. It's all hands on deck. There's no choice. You have to solve it. You have to do it. You have to get in and move together as a group. And, you're not done until you're done. Right. And on farming, you're never done. You can never weed too many weeds. You can never, prune too much. There's always something going on the ranch. So yeah, it definitely does. But I wouldn't trade it for the world. I'm I absolutely love the dynamic of working on a farm.
Wonderful. And Kristine, I'm kind of curious now. I mean, I'm not expecting you to grow up on a turkey farm, but what's the arc of your personal story to be arriving in this kind of space yourself?
No, but the neighbors behind us were 10,000 acres of cow pasture, and those cows were some of my BFFs. And next door was a corn farm. Although we were not a farm, we did have 13 acres, and we had a garden that by today's standards would have been a CSA. We grew more than we could eat, than we could give away. And so every week we harvested, and my mom brought it to the grocery store and we sold it. That doesn't really happen in today's world, but that was, I think, fundamental to me. And more importantly, in that story, my mom, I love you, but she was an awful cook. She hated cooking. And so her was like, check, one more meal done for the day. And so we had this gorgeous, lush garden, but her answer for everything was, oh, a beet, you just wash it and eat it like an apple. So I developed this really deep appreciation for the real flavor of food, fresh out of a garden, unadulterated, not prepared in any way, shape, or form. You know, gleaning apples from the apple trees, pear trees, plum tree, raspberry bushes. You know, it didn't matter if it was snap peas, green beans, tomatoes, you know, carrots, beets. I ate them all raw, gleaned fresh forage. And I think that really developed an appreciation for food and how good food can make you feel. But then also the community of our food system that raises and grows food for us because of the neighbors that we are surrounded by.
Yeah, I mean, that's so, like, I can't even imagine the dynamic where there's a 13-acre farm next to a 10,000-acre farm, and presumably the corn thing was probably similar in size. Like, how did it come to pass that there was a 13-acre patch of land in between these massive otherwise farms?
So we were in Rochester, Minnesota, and we were just out on the edge of town. 2 miles from my house was like suburbia, but town was starting to expand. So on the opposite side of our road was a housing development. And ironically, it's still exactly like that today. It hasn't changed. It never did evolve to develop that area fully. The land that is the cow acres behind our house, the pasture, you know, the children now own it and will probably sell off the land. The parents have passed away, but it still is pretty untouched. So it's just kind of, I mean, a rare moment in time that I got to grow up in, surrounded by kind of both sides of it. I could walk 2 miles and be in a suburb as a kid, as a fifth grader. And I could also roam with the cows and spend hours at the creek and hopping. You know, when cows get close to the creek, there's all these, like, their feet sink into the mud, and then there are these little, you know, stumps of patches of dirt. And I can't tell you how many hours I spent leapfrogging that as a kid.
Super fun. All right, wonderful. I love both of these contexts because they marry up beautifully for what we're going to talk about. Now, we're going to use turkey and turkey farming as kind of a lens on regenerative generally. So when I ask the question about turkey, if there's something that doesn't apply more broadly, I think worth calling that out. So I kind of want to start with just kind of what turkey farming, and it can be US-centric, looks like today. Like, I want to understand the terrible, the okay, the scale of this. Like, just come at me with all the understanding and the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, so going straight to the top, right? Like, if you're a highly conventional turkey farm, you have in the United States, I'll speak to what I know, would be fully sided barns, right? Very controlled environment the birds live in. And, you know, depending upon where you're located in the United States and also what time of year, the birds may or may not have access outside. It just kind of depends. Typically, the feed is corn and soy. It's a very fast feed formula so that the birds grow quickly, right, and get to market quickly. That's going to be your most conventional farm. There are many, you know, turkey is typically in a very large conglomerate, right? It's basically an add-on for poultry producers. Most poultry producers in the United States are chicken. Chicken comes first because chicken is so much, you know, higher consumption rate than turkey. So really they're chicken farmers, and then they have turkey. At Diestal, you know, we have scale. We can produce birds at a national level and service our customers nationally. However, you know, our farming is a bit different in the sense that we have always taken a lot of onus on the quality of the birds in their environment as they're being raised. And the quality of their food is really important, as well as, like raising the birds for the specific breed that they are. So, that's kind of the Diestal story. And you still have some backyard flocks. You still have some very smaller regional operators that really service like just their core kind of, 100-mile radius. But we would be, on the lower side of the middle. And our production is a quarter of a % of the total annual turkey production. So we are also quite small. We're just very specific in our niche and what we do.
Okay. And kind of getting to and I want to just focus in on the conventional, I think was the term you used, farming. It sounds like this is purely economically driven in terms of what will it cost to feed them, how quickly can they get to a point where someone will agree to buy them for a prescribed price, driven probably by distributors and large retailers, and then...
Yeah, I mean, it's volume over values at that point, right? So you're contracting. Most of those operations will contract their farmers, and it's a specific number of live pounds coming off the ranch and, into the processing plant. And, that's just their goals. That's the lens in which they operate.
Yeah. And just in terms of this is a loaded question for sure, because it sets us up for the research we're going to talk about. But in terms of non-economic outcomes or impacts, maybe the better word, like help me understand what conventional farming looks like with regards to the things we can talk about today, soil or biodiversity or any of these things.
Yeah, well, in a conventional world, if they don't have outdoor access, they have basically no interaction with any dirt or outdoor space. And then, their feed is grown conventionally and definitely is sourced on the board, as they say, just at the cheapest market price as possible. And it's typically filled with, dried distillers grains or animal byproducts or something like this. So it's just, the cheapest ratio to get these birds, through the barns and to market with the most amount of pounds, right? That's kind of that view.
Got it. Okay. And I want to come back. I want to dial into the research in a little bit because I think that's fascinating. But I want to just understand, before farmers, and that might be a silly question, but that's partly my role, I think, is to ask silly questions. I'm curious to understand, what does a turkey look like if it's not being farmed? What's a turkey doing? Is it what's its relationship to the land? What's it eating? How is it growing up pre-farming?
Yeah, so a wild bird, turkeys are actually native to North America here, and a wild bird is technically an omnivore. They're eating, seeds, they're foraging for their food, insects, worms, maybe they get lucky and they get a rodent or something, that's left around. But they are mostly land animals. They can fly, but it exudes a ton of energy, and they really save that for if they're, have predator pressure or something like this. They are migratory, so they will move around with the seasons. But they're outside, they're exuding their behaviors, they're foraging for their food, and the fittest survive.
Yeah, and I guess the follow-on that I've got from here, and I'm thinking about some of the other modern farming techniques, and we don't need to go into them in detail, but they potentially and in theory, and according to some of these, and we've interviewed someone on this show, Eddie Badrina from Eden Gardens, I think it is, down in Texas. The nature of which a bird is growing up and the environment's growing up in, if it's in the wild, and I guess the quality of the bird that's produced purely from a nutritional value and some of the stuff that's going to be in the research, how does that look against one that's grown up in your actual farmed world, in a regenerative farmed world?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. I mean, we haven't done a study or an analysis that way. So we haven't looked at a wild bird, right, and said, what is the nutrient density of the wild bird against a Diestal bird? We've certainly done it from a conventional standpoint to a Diestal bird, but I'm not sure. I think that the wild birds are not necessarily consuming food for human, through a human lens, right? Or for our consumption, right? We're farm animal ag. So I think it could look quite different. And it's a question, Vincent, that now I really want to know the answer to.
When you said survival of the fittest before, I was thinking kind of this, Bear Grylls kind of bird who's out there.
Yeah,
just crushing
definitely.
it.
I mean,
Might not be great to eat, but this guy's like super fit and he's ripped, or she.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, wild birds are not necessarily, it depends on your taste, right? But they're
Sure.
not necessarily the most wonderful eating experience you could ever have with a turkey. I'm sure that there are some people who may feel differently about that. I think that it's going to be a very lean animal with like minimal fat, just what they need to survive. So yeah, the taste will be completely different. Yes.
Yeah. Well, maybe there's maybe another even niche of a market for that.
For sure.
Coming out to the bird for a moment, just thinking more broadly about the ecosystem, that either a wild turkey or even, one farmed in a regenerative way, help me understand the relationship between the turkey and I don't know, on this open question, I'm not sure who best to ask, but the ecosystem that it lives in.
Yeah, I guess I'll say this. Regenerative farming and the notion of what is regenerative didn't start with poultry, right? It started with scientists, and it started more of the conversation when it came into agriculture, came in with ruminant animals. This is really, cows, bison. This is really where the conversation got started. But Diestel, our family felt strongly that, the birds played a part, right? Just as every living animal or organism, etc., plays a part in our ecosystem. And we really struggled to prove concept of that. We really struggled to find people who agreed with us until we met Regenefied. It was like people were kind of gatekeeping the regenerative playground, if you will, and saying, hey, how can poultry be regenerative? And that's when, when we met Regenefied, we met, along with Kristine and everyone at Regenefied, actual farmers who understood, they farmed. They were not, idealists and just kind of creating a thesis, if you will, but they said, hey, yes, of course turkey plays a role. And then how do we make turkey play a role in a really meaningful way? And that's kind of where Kristine came in, and her team came in and helped us understand how we could take what we were already doing and maximize it into their program.
Interesting. And I'm going to go down that rabbit hole for a bit because I think it's a good segue. Like, it might help to start with a really good and Kristine, I'm assuming you would have one of these, a definition of regenerative farming in its broadest sense, not specifically just for turkeys. Like, let's understand that first, and then I've got a couple of follow-on questions.
Yeah, in its broadest sense, regenerative agriculture is about farming in harmony with nature. It's about thinking about how you practice and your farming practices and how they influence life in the soil, and then how that influences life above the soil, which is what you're growing and raising on a farm. Even in the case of turkeys, it applies to all situations. And so soil is one of those amazing tipping points that when you start getting soil functioning again, you start getting water cycles functioning again, you start getting nutrient cycles functioning again, you start getting energy cycles functioning again, and you start building biodiversity. And the more function you have within those ecosystems, the more diversity you have on the land, the more resilient that land becomes.
Can you define the resilience there? Is it resilience to pests or changes in the conditions, or like what's the resilience to?
There's so many layers to it. This is the beautiful thing. So I'll tell you a story of one of our farms is located in an area of Canada that had severe drought this year, significant drought. They've been farming and practicing regeneratively, building up the health of the soil for over a decade now. And their farming practices have changed the landscape. It's changed ecosystem function within their land. Most of their neighbors had 100% crop loss. They're farming small grains in dryland farming. They had a 50% yield this year because nature was cycling, right? And so when we talk about resilience in that ecosystem, we can break it down to a bunch of different things. We can talk about every single drop of rain that did fall on their land that summer being captured and drawn down into the soil because they have that permeable layer that allows it to soak in and get captured by the system rather than run off, right? How many videos have you seen where water's running off the land? They captured every drop. Not only did they capture every drop, the soil was utilizing it, and they had plants, they had living roots and plant canopy on every acre of their farm. They didn't have any bare soil exposed. And so what happens in that is you've got that water being utilized by the plant being drawn up, and you've got this mini water cycle that's happening between the soil and the plant. kind of keeping that moisture there. Right now, you've got a bigger cycle that's happening in the ecosystem of rain, that, evaporation that goes up to the clouds. Well, you've got water resilience right there. That changes the game in terms of what can grow, how can grow on a land. But now let's take a look at a different layer on that same that same cut, and then we can move off of it. But we can look at this from multiple perspectives. They had 50% crop harvest this year, where their neighbors had total loss. Now we're talking about an economic resilience.
Yeah, it's like, I guess that's the reason why I'm kind of drilling in on it, is when I think about kind of regenerative farming, I'm kind of thinking about, Heidi used the term ruminants, cows rewilding the land by stomping around. Like, this is kind of the TED Talk limited lens of regenerative farming, not to be trite, but, to a very narrow view of, we can have these things and they can rewild the land. But regenerative farming, and how you've just described it, is more saying that if you are actually more in sync with the larger ecosystem at play on your farm, then your farm will have durability, resilience on a whole number of levels, whether it's economic and whether it's resistance to external changes like drought that you mentioned, or even, I'm just keeping, the potato famine or whatever other sort of monoculture type risk that also exist.
Yeah, pests, disease, all of them. And let's take it in context of Diestal's turkey farm, right? Let's take a look at the ranch. So in that system, they've got their barns where the turkeys have a safe, sheltered area they can hang out. They have these outdoor patio spaces and access to larger areas of land outside. Well, in that ecosystem, they've got all of these vibrant, different types of plants growing. They've got shade for those turkeys to be under. They've got tall grasses for those turkeys to be out in. Because they've got all that happening in the outdoors, and because they're thinking about soil health in those spaces, they're getting more bacteria and fungal colonies building and growing underneath the soil. So down below the soil, you've got all this life happening. Well, that attracts more bugs in the area. And remember, Heidi was telling us earlier that those turkeys love rooting around and hunting and pecking for those kind of bugs. So now you've got the worms, you've got the bugs, you've got these tall grasses, you've got the shade cover. Now you've got a virtual playground that these turkeys want to go out and play in.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, this is beautiful. This is perfect. Act one. Let's jump into the research itself, because I want to understand kind of the breadth of the research and kind of what it went into. But I'm also curious as to what the motivations were going into doing a bit of research, and the dynamic that existed between the farm and Regenefied in creating it, coming up. Like, what are you solving for? Help me understand that context first, and then we can dive into the actual research.
Yeah, I mean, really, Regenefied brought the opportunity for this research to us and asked if we would be interested in looking at the nutrient density of the meat. And our family was thrilled, because we had never had a third-party certifier not only just bring the concept, but also connect us to, a scientist, the state of Utah, who we use to look at the nutrient density. And, this is a really big deal, because let's think about it. If you're, no matter where you are in the world, if you have a product you're selling and it's more expensive, you're doing it the right way. The birds are healthier and happier. it tastes better, but you still have to convince the customer to pay more for it. How else, what buttons are we pressing, right? There's only so much, there's only so far you're going to go with, you feel better, you're going to taste it, taste matters. And it really came back to can we tell a story with nutrient density? And can we show that all the work we're doing on the farm, how, we actually source, we do our best to source certified Regenefied feed, so that the corn and soy that the birds are consuming is from a Regenefied source. How does that play out into the meat? And so, yeah, I mean, it was fantastic. And, I think Kristine and her team brought this our way because they had already been doing some studies with beef and were finding some really interesting results. And it was no different with us. We were thrilled. Kristine, I don't know if you want to speak to kind of the methodology there.
Yeah, I mean, so it started for Regenefied back in 2023. And research had been, research was out there, and, testing nutrients in food isn't a new thing, but not necessarily super cost effective. And so we started piloting what would it look like to make testing available to farms? Because we know at the end of the day, in order to change our food system, we need people at every layer of the food system to get excited about a new vision for a different future. At the farming level, we need farms to get excited about the prospect of changing the way that they practice and practicing in ways that are in service to their business, in service to resilience. We need suppliers in the middle to care about where they're sourcing from, to segregate and separate. We need brands saying we care about this and we're going to source from these farms. We need retailers saying we're going to shelf this product. And at the end of it, we need consumers who are saying, I'm willing to go to the shelf and buy it. And like Heidi mentioned, right now in that equation, getting a product, a really high quality product through that entire system to an end consumer makes those products a little bit higher priced. There needs to be a value proposition for that. At every layer, every person in that chain needs to have a reason why. And so when you ask consumers, and we actually did some research this summer, if you ask consumers why, well, they want what's in it for me. I want to get a better quality product. And that comes down to taste and nutrients. If it tastes better and is better for me, I can do it. And so we were very much interested in understanding what's happening. There's been a significant amount of research and some peer-reviewed studies on the subject that really links the health of soil, the nutrient cycling within soil, to the health of the plant matter. And then even further research that takes that from the health of the soil into the health of the plant matter into the animals who ate those plants. And so it was natural for us to want to open that information up and allow that folks within the Regenefied network to tap into research and testing to figure out how their farming practices were influencing the outcomes they were achieving with the products that were growing, whether that's plants or that's raising animals who are eating the plants that are growing on that land. And I think what it does is it just helps people understand the true impact, which is what Regenefied is, a certification company, not just for a seal on a pack, for helping people understand the true impact that regenerative agriculture is having. So the further we can go down that chain to show change in land management, changes ecosystem functions, changes water cycles, changes energy capture, which is ultimately carbon storage, all the way down to changes the nutrient quality of the food. Now that gives people more things to share, and that gives people more reasons to support. And that's really what our interest was.
Okay, that's super interesting. And I guess kind of where I was going with this was, and we've had a lot of sustainable angled kind of dialogue on the show over the last 5 years. And one theme that seems recurrent is this idea that even with great environmental outcomes, consumers will still vote with the, as you call it, Kristine, what's in it for me. And I remember I spoke to the largest solar installer, not actually on the show, just in casual, about motivations that people had to install solar. And I said, is it to save the environment? He goes, no. I said, it's a cost. He says, not really. I said, well, what is it? He says, people just want to be able to turn lights on and not feel guilty about it. And I was like, fascinating insight, right?
Yeah.
But there's this whole other thing that's actually why people, in a lot of cases, in his experience, were putting solar. And I kind of feel like it's, when you say to someone who is not on the regenerative side of the fence, hey, you should think about eating a regenerative farmed product, in this case, turkey, because it's good for land and it's good for soil and, the environment matters. You're instantly going up against whatever position they already have on this topic. But if you say that it tastes better, it's kind of, you don't care about the rest of your values. This thing costs about 11% more, but it tastes better. I'm not sure what the actual number is, obviously. It's a totally different conversation. It's a much easier conversation to have with an individual. Kristine, I guess my question is part of this about understanding that if you really want to be starting to shift the mainstream onto this, you have to be having conversations with individuals on topics that matter to them, either taste and nutritional density?
Absolutely. You're spot on. If there's nothing in it for me, I'll do it when it's convenient or when it's the easy choice. But when push comes to shove, we all live in these very dynamic lives with a lot of complexities. I don't know anybody who doesn't have a life that looks like that. And so you have this matrix of decisions you have to make every single day. And the more the decisions I'm making serve me, the easier it is for me to make that commitment. And when it has other added value benefits, like supporting farms, helping create better livelihoods, it makes me feel even better about the choices that I'm making. And so I think, you boil it down to it. And we did consumer research, as I mentioned this summer. We did a poll of 850 consumers across the US, really representative of age, income, gender, representative of the US population. rural, urban dwellers, just to understand where are consumers at in this equation and what do they care about? Are they familiar with regenerative agriculture? What gets them excited about it? And what we found in that study is that the broader general population, about 12% of the US population does not care about the quality of the food they're eating. The only thing that they want is the best tasting, best priced product. A very distant third is a brand that they already know and recognize. Grandma always bought Quaker Oats, so I'm going to buy it because it's almost cheap enough. It's almost the cheapest one, and I know it tastes good, right? So it already you can see it already played back to one of those top two. But that's only 12% of the population. 88% of the population is considering a broader spectrum of values. And so as we narrow this down, we look at it and we understand of this 88% of the population who really gets and is interested and will support regenerative agriculture. And we identified that 32% of that 88, which means 20% of the US population as a total, has the interest, the drive, and the motivation to support regenerative agriculture. And they care about all the things. They actually care about the quality and integrity of the food. They care about the livelihoods of the farmer. They care about water systems. They care about all of those things. In fact, when we gave them a list of, I think it was 12 to 15 different categories, and we asked them to rank on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not very important, 10 being extremely important to you, guess what? These, what I'm calling the emerging regenerative market, every single one of them ranked every single one of those points between a 7 and a 10 in terms of value. All important. They're all important. Well, you know what we also asked? We asked, well, if you can only pick 3, which ones matter to you?
Right.
Do you know what those 3 were?
Taste, I'm sure. No.
Taste wasn't in there because that wasn't part of the value that we gave them. But every consumer in the study said taste was one of their top purchase behavior decisions. It was the highest ranking of any other thing. But when we asked them about regenerative agriculture values and why they would support it, the consumers across all of the segments, specifically the most diligent values-based shopper who really care and are ready to pay more, go out of their way to support regenerative agriculture, said, look, ultimately I'm going to buy it because it's healthier for the soil, which creates healthier plants, which means I'm going to get a better quality, healthier product. Guess what all 3 of those things actually say? They say, what's in it for me as a consumer? I'm drawing the thread there. No one picked water in their top 3. They weren't picking, farmer livelihoods. They love all of those things, but when push comes to shove, they're going to follow the through thread of what's going to benefit them. And not to be selfish, these consumers care about all the things. But if you really want to know what's going to drive behavior change, there has to be a value proposition for every single player.
Yeah, and then obviously the research is about saying, can we prove it? Before we get to kind of one of the magical questions I have about the research, I want to understand the specifics around nutritional density in the context of the research itself. And part of where I'm going with this question is, and the reason I'm reminded of this, I was back in Perth a week ago, and I was down south with my best mate, and he's very big on a lot of this, and he eats meat. So he's not like full vegan or vegetarian, but he doesn't eat a lot of meat, but he eats incredibly high quality meat when he does eat the meat. And the reason why I'm leading with this is a lot of how he described the product to me in terms of its nutritional value was talking about what wasn't in the product, like nitrates, rather than talking about what was in the product. And so I'm keen to understand with the research, you were looking at nutritional density of what the product produced as a result of its context and how it was fed and how it was raised. But I'm also interested in understanding what doesn't go in and how that's also impacted. So help me understand that in the context of the research.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so for this particular study that we did, we took raw, unadulterated, unprocessed meat. So whole breast meat and then ground turkey thigh meat, basically. And that's what we put in. So we put in the Diestal regenerative product, and then we went to the store and bought the same thing, just a conventional breast and a conventional grind, and sent those both into the lab to have them tested side by side. Each round of testing is tested 3 times, and then the analysis is put together from there. So you have statistically significant results and feedback. I will say, though, what isn't in your food, what isn't used as a processing aid or an ingredient, like phosphates and nitrates and artificial colors and flavors and additives and unnatural sugars and all of these things, is really important, right? Because it brings you further and further away from the quality of the bird or the animal or whatever it is that you're consuming. It's no different for plants than it is for meat, right? Like if you take a beet, using Kristine's example from earlier, and, you completely process it, you're reducing the nutrient density in that beet as you continue to cook it and make it into a different form. This is why, if you're really working on becoming a bodybuilder or something like this, they're consuming, natural, very lean cuts of meat, and they're not consuming even the best quality hot dog. They're not going to touch it, right? They're only going to have the best quality turkey breast they can find.
Got it. And so from the perspective of the study, it was about saying, forget what happens downstream for now, even though that is obviously a factor in the product that people consume, just looking at literally a chicken breast and turkey breast and a turkey breast, not even cooked, presumably.
Yeah.
What does it look like? What are you actually looking for in terms of, I don't know what the word nutritional density means, other than that means that there's more nutrition in there.
Yeah.
Like, what are we actually talking about?
Yeah. So, I mean, you're looking at the phytochemical levels, right? The antioxidants. You're looking at omega-3, omega-6 ratios. You're looking at vitamins and mineral levels in the meat. We did also look at the protein content of the meat. And that is also another kind of very interesting point that we got back. But you're really looking at the micro ingredients. On a macro level, we didn't anticipate to change the macro level of the turkey meat itself, right? But on the micro ingredients, we certainly were hopeful and ultimately found some really interesting and great feedback.
Got it. Okay, cool. That's I guess I'm always trying to understand kind of what's important, what's signal and what's noise when it comes to this. So just coming back a little bit on terms of kind of going into the research, and it might be a silly question again. I'm pretty good at that. Did you ever have any concerns that you would go into this and there wouldn't be any difference?
I didn't, no, because no, I really didn't. No, not for a moment, because it's so invested in what we do. There's no way that our products, and we have been yearning for something like this for a long time. So I know how many things Diestel does. Like, I know how many touch points we have on our farm in, the way that we handle the product, the way we process the product, and just how we've maintained that quality, that I was so confident it would come through on the study analysis. I mean, I guess now looking back, I should have had some concerns, but I didn't. Anyway.
Yeah.
Well, and Heidi, I didn't really give you a chance to question it, because the data that we've been seeing, with all of the farms that have been sending in their nutrient density testing, there is a very consistent trend. And Heidi, you mentioned it. The macros, the main mineral and vitamin contents don't change that much across farming methodology, because if we didn't know how to meet a turkey's basic vitamin and mineral needs, that turkey wouldn't survive to become a product to eat. But what we haven't yet uncovered, what we've done is we've, whether it's a cow or it's a turkey or it's corn growing in a farm, we understand the macros that are critical to prevent disease and death of the crop. But what we haven't gotten to is that level of sophistication that nature has gotten to, which is all of the other stuff we actually need. And we've started to learn this, that you just can't take copious amounts of vitamin A and get the same impact you get when you eat a carrot. There's all these other helpers within that carrot that enable and support the utilization of that vitamin A and other compounds we don't even understand that are relevant in how our body processes and utilizes that effectively. The same thing's happening within the soil. That's why that nutrient cycling is so critical. You unlock the cycling of nutrients. It makes a lot more nutrients bioavailable. It allows those plants to develop a lot more diverse nutrient profile. And when consumed by the animals, like the turkeys, that translates into their metabolites and changes their function in their nature. And so consistently, we see changes in fatty acid profiles, the omega-6 to 3 ratio, where the omega-6 ratio is going down and the omega-3 ratio is going up. And in the antioxidants category, we see the presence of numerous antioxidants that aren't present in conventionally raised systems, and others that are at much higher levels because of the biodiversity of that ecosystem. And so these very consistently happen. And then that antioxidant category, those phytonutrients, that's actually where the flavor comes from. There are subcategories within that are flavanols, and they're flavor influencers. So that explains why these foods with richer nutrients taste better. But we've seen that enough. I've seen that enough through the research coming in that there's no question in my mind. And so I don't think I let Heidi even consider that they could have.
Wasn't going to be the answer that you were expecting, kind of thing. You actually touched on something, Heidi, that I want to go into there, where you said a lot of this confidence came from, the dozens or many touch points that you have throughout the whole process. And I kind of want to understand a few of those. There might be some secret sauce in there, but you probably would prefer a larger regenerative turkey market globally anyway, so I don't share as much as you're happy to. But I'm also curious not only what some of those things are that you're doing in a practical sense on the farm at any point in the process, not just necessarily at the food point. But the other thing I'm curious about is how you've arrived at those. Like, you talk about being fourth generation. Did some of those, like, is it great uncle Jack, was it? I think I remember reading on the website. Like, how did these things come to be? Or some of these more recently where you've actually gone and looked at research, and I know with your background you've obviously gone a lot deeper.
Yeah.
Help me understand that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many, so let me just kind of summarize a couple that might be very interesting. First and foremost, my great uncle Ernest Botini, got us into farming as a family. My grandfather founded Diestal Turkey Ranch in 1949. Like, a founding principle of the farm is do right by the bird and the bird will do right by you. That was kind of like a statement, that our family trades around. But one of the key things that my brother Jason actually brought back to the farm, he studied, went through college. He went on a boys' trip through New Zealand and Australia. And he had a marvelous time, but he was really genuinely, not just because we're talking, he was really hit in the face with how sustainable and thoughtful Australia was in the soil nutrient discussion. And this was like, well, I'm going to date him, but at least, 15, 20 years ago, right? And he came back just talking about like how impressed he was with the conversations he was having with farmers, as he kind of rucked across, the country. And he thought to himself, this has to be a point of conversation at our farm. We have a bunch of organic waste. How are we cleaning our barns? How are we working with the soil? And so one of the things he did is he went out and found a gentleman who was creating a stabilized probiotic cleaning solution, that the intention of the cleaning solution was to be used in a commercial farm or inside even a processing plant. And it was very, very safe. And so any like chemical cleaner, anything that was even remotely close to a chemical cleaner, we pulled off of the ranches and put in this probiotic cleaning solution. And, that was something that was really different, because the reality is like, you need to keep a clean environment, right? Like, we don't have any antibiotics that go into the birds. There's no way to quote unquote save a flock if they get sick. And so what we found though was that we were enriching the microbial environment, right? Those good bugs were out competing the bad bugs, and the birds were healthier, right? In a way, because they had the beneficial bacteria that they needed, right, as they were growing. And the barns are more clean. We had less issues with any type of buildup and, kind of the gunk that builds up. It was phenomenal, so it's something like this that Jason really continued to push and lean forward on and find a solution to. All the way back to my grandfather's day, when ice bath chilling was the quickest way to chill and the cleanest way to chill poultry, right? And genuinely, like, we still do it today. You hear about like continuous water chillers or, probably more economical solutions for chillers, but we literally have, a stainless steel bin And we put ice and water and the birds, and that is, we ice chill all of our birds. And that maintains the integrity of the meat. It has very, very little water uptake, and it just keeps, the birds fresh and clean and cold, which is exactly what you want in poultry.
Got it. And I kind of, you talked a bit about kind of things that are happening around the bird. You touched on corn and soy being the feedstock for the birds and buying better versions of those. In terms of their diet and their lifestyle, like what's happening, on any box of eggs in Australia, there's a picture of a bunch of, chickens floating around in a large paddock enjoying themselves. What's the dynamic with the bird on the land outside of the barns? I'm curious about that part.
Yeah, so they have access outside onto these paddocks. They can exude all of their natural characteristics and behaviors, scratch and peck and jump on rocks or, whatever they might find, forage for insects. Some of them get into trees, believe it or not, which is super fun to get them out of the trees. So yeah, they're very much, exuding all their natural behaviors. And I will say, also back to why we were so confident, the nutrient study is because the feed is such a critical component of the bird's health and vitality, right? I mean, if we eat super high fatty food that, is supposed to give us a lot of calories and a lot of fuel really quickly, but, that's all we consume, we're going to be putting on a bunch of fat. We're probably not going to feel super great, right? And we're going to get very big. It's same for the birds, right? So we source a really high quality, the best quality we can within our means of corn and soy. We mill it ourselves so that we keep a very slow feed formula that helps the birds to grow naturally. And then they reach their naturally intended weight versus pushing them to get really big really fast. I mean, we're in farm animal ag. We are eventually harvesting the birds for meat consumption, but we want to do it slowly and consistently with the birds' pace versus our own pace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, in some respects, and I don't think this is specifically America, but you're definitely pushing up against kind of this American bigger is better type of ideal. Someone will pull out a turkey and go, look how big it is. That's a measure of whether it's going to taste any good or be any good for you. There's probably a whole narrative to change there. I'm kind of just in that context around what it is that you're doing on the farm. I'm curious as to, Kristine, as to where Regenefied fits into that, because as an organisation, you're trying to elevate the dialogue around regenerative farming, but you're also playing a role in saying this is good, this needs to be improved. This is what you can stand behind. How does that equation fit into what the guys are doing down on the farm?
Yeah, so at Regenefied, we do a boots on the ground verification. We're going out into the field on all of the farms that we verify, and we're capturing data. We're looking at management practices, capturing evidence of those management practices in place. We're doing things like water infiltration testing. We're doing soil cores so we can capture samples of the soil and send it off to the lab to test soil health metrics. We're really looking at all the different 6 soil health principles that are at play in a farm and measuring all 4 of the ecosystem outcomes to show that the management practices are there and that the farm is influencing their ecosystem in a positive way by building up soil organic matter, for example, or building water holding capacity within a farm, or increasing the cycling of nutrients within the soil. And so that happens annually on verified farms within Regenefied's network. And then that data goes back to that farm. So they understand the impact that they're having, and they can use that data at a farm level to make agronomic decisions. But that they can also use that data to help tell the story of the impact that they're having to create value across the supply chain.
Yeah, understood. And I kind of, where I'm going with this, because we've had some chats over the last 5 years about bringing a standard to market and kind of an intel inside, and you can trust this because it has this stamp of approval on it. How does that dynamic work between yourselves and the farms generally that you're working with? And is it sounds like there's obviously a boots on the ground bit as you described it, but is there advocacy beyond that to say we need to get more of this stuff into more distributors? How does the dynamic play in terms of the larger economic aims that you guys are collectively trying to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dynamic started, it started a few years ago, even just in the development of our standards. So Regenefied, and Heidi kind of touched on this earlier, but didn't say it directly, was founded by farmers and soil scientists and researchers. They were pioneers in the industry who have spent 25 to 30 years of their career really understanding farms, how farms operate, how nature operates, and how farms can create resilience and profitability through different farming practices. That became known as regenerative agriculture. So all of that historic knowledge and context and experience went into writing our standards. So when Regenefied wrote our standards, we didn't just hurry up and get them out there. What the Regenefied team did was go out and solicit feedback on them from different stakeholders like USDA, different retailers like Whole Foods Market, to get input and understanding of barriers to people's understanding about what we're doing and why. And so the advocacy really started back there. It's about making sure that people had the right marker. In fact, Regenefied was founded to protect regenerative agriculture against greenwashing, because there are a lot of folks who are raising their hands saying, yeah, we're going to be regenerative, but there's no common definition for what regenerative agriculture is. And so, you asked earlier if I could define it. At its very, very core, it's simple, but getting everybody to agree that it's a system. Regenerative agriculture is ultimately a system where you can't take away any individual part of that system and still have functioning. And making sure that we had that, and that people could understand the complexity of that system and the diversity of that, and that there could be standards that could monitor and measure and report to show if a farm was actually regenerative. And then we, obviously go out and do the boots on the ground verification, capturing data, giving that data back to the farm. But once they meet our standards at tier 2 or above, then they carry a certification. And that comes with a mark you can see on a package, like on Diestel's turkey. You can see that on shelf on their packaging to show that they've gotten that verification and that there's data behind their claim that they're regenerating. And so there's that, but then there is, we talked about, how do we get retailers involved? How do we get supply chains involved? How do we get consumers involved in this conversation? All of that has to happen. And Regenefied, while we kind of stay in that lane of a verification and certification company, does things like the consumer research so that we can help provide information and data to the market to make informed decisions.
Yeah, I'm super curious about it, because I think, let's say you do dozens of these like bits of research and they all show this beautiful narrative, and you would notice, given your role and background, if it can't get to the consumer, that 20% that you were talking about who are in there, I would consider this is an option for me, and allow them to take that information on and use it to influence their decision making, then the ultimate aims that, the family ranch has and the other constituents inside Regenefied as well can't be achieved. Heidi, I kind of want to bring us back to you and the farm. Obviously, you were super excited to get to be involved in doing the research to demonstrate and prove something that you already knew, which I love. But just in terms of your, where to from here with not just the research, but more broadly driving and gaining more acceptance for, regenerative farming as a method for choosing a better product and making a decision that's better more broadly? How are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, I think for us, we really think that obviously scaling the program is going to have its own challenges. And so we really want to work on scaling the program, making it larger and more accessible. I think also being able to talk about and state the nutrient density results on the product's package in a way that consumers can relate to is going to be really important. And that's never been done. And that's not something that will be an easy thing to do. But, it's something that we're going to certainly work towards, because people should know, we should understand the nutrient density of our food, right? We should have a better understanding of it. At least in the United States, you can find an organic apple, at a Walmart, at a Kroger, right? At these very large big box format stores. You can also find an organic apple at your CSA, farm or your farmer's market. And, when we look at the quality and the nutrient density of that food, we're choosing something that maybe says it's certified organic because we think it's better for us. But do we understand the nutrient density of it? And is it truly going to give us the nutrients that we need? Regenerative is coming forth with data-based, results, right? Not just for the ecosystem, not just for the birds and the health of the birds, but also for the actual nutrient density of the food that we are consuming, which fuels us. We are made of the food we eat. And so there's nothing more important than understanding that nutrient density. That's number one. So I think for us, that's kind of where we're headed. I don't know. I don't think we have ever shared the results of the nutrient density, and I feel like we should. Would you like, okay.
I tried to give you a leading question.
I know.
Kind of...
So, yeah. So we had 1.8 times better omega-3, omega-6 ratios on the breast meat of our turkey versus, a conventional brand, which while, turkey isn't necessarily statistically significant for this ratio, right? You might be consuming salmon or fish oils or something like this. I think what we'd like to do is really challenge the nature of kind of nutrient stacking, right? So looking at all those micronutrients, consuming like your friend who maybe eats meat more seldomly, but when he does, has extremely high quality meat. It's this kind of a concept. So 1.8 times better. And on the ground turkey side, there were 14 times higher antioxidant levels than the conventional brand that we tested. And of course, the phytochemical antioxidants strengthen the immune system, right? Reduce inflammation, all of the things that we very much regulating hormones that we very much need in our diet today. And then, those were the two big key takeaways. And the third takeaway, which was a bonus, is less to do with farming and more to do with the processing, because it related to the macro level of the protein. We actually had higher protein content in both the breast and the ground turkey than the conventional brand. And that speaks more specifically to the way that ice bath chill, right? The way that we're maintaining the integrity and the quality of the meat in the processing and the packaging to the consumer. And so that was really exciting also because, all the way through our program, from the farm and the feed to the processing and the packaging, it really validated, the extra effort we go through to ensure that the customer has the best protein they can possibly have from our farm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I think getting to the specifics of the actual data is critical. I think ultimately we're living now in a society where some bloke I think he's in Colorado, isn't he? He's going around measuring himself and doing all kinds of unusual things to his body. I'm talking about Brian Johnson, obviously. But I guess where I'm going to here is that we are, as a society, becoming to the point where we're like, cool, I get your story, I understand your narrative, show me the data. And to be able to actually say, here's a place in Utah and all they do is research this type of stuff, and here's what they have found. Like, we're Switzerland. We just sent the stuff to them and they send us back the results. So, if they'd said something else, we would have had to go back to our knitting and try to work out what other ice baths we need to offer the animals. I kind of want to get to probably one last, it's a statement, but it's also a question, because I want to understand how you're seeing this from where you're standing as well. I think for a long time, the narrative around animal products generally have kind of been that it's not that good for you and it's not that good for the environment. And I feel like the narrative is evolving to, bad meat is not good for you, but meat that's not that bad is actually not that bad for you and not that bad for the environment, or even, in your case, completely positive. How are you seeing that narrative evolve, and where's that going, do you think?
Yeah, I was just at a conference last week where there was quite in the sustainable food world in the United States, and there was a bit of rhetoric around, animals being detrimental to the climate or to our environment, not consuming the animals. And I guess I'll say, it's entirely the opposite, right? When you think about, my grandfather just recently turned 99 years old. Really great genetics over here. So I've got a long way to go.
And lots of good turkey.
Yes. And when I think about the way that he was raised, the way that he consumed meat, he consumed probably far less meat than I am consuming today. But that's just by nature of the fact that, he had an ice box, right? He didn't have, electricity was quite new, and, you utilized it much differently than how we do today, right? So as we have modernized and really provided ourselves the convenience of accessing meat, we are consuming more of it, which is why it's paramount that as we produce, just like anything in our country, whether it be produce or the corn and the soy or the birds, the cows, we need to be doing this thoughtfully, and we need to contribute. Agriculture can be a massive contributor to a climate conscious way of farming, right? One that is going to support our ecosystems versus tear them down. And I think that is what is mission critical, is finding those farmers, whether it's local to you or regional to you, that are supporting and actually thoughtfully recognizing their role in the greater ecosystem. And through that, right, you're going to have a healthier planet, you're going to have a healthier bird, you're going to have higher nutrient density in that bird. And I think that is the way to the future of food and the future of farming, definitely.
Beautiful. Kristine, do you want to add anything to that? Otherwise, I don't know.
I think you summed it up really well. I mean, we're in a critical tipping point right now that we can't afford to keep operating the way that we're operating. We're losing arable land. We're losing nutrient density in our food. The human species is sick. Our climate is changing. We're struggling, and regenerative agriculture has a pathway out of it. It's a tipping point that can be a catalyst for so many other things that at the end of the day impacts human health, impacts our ability to continue to eat. It's just a powerful lever that, when embraced, can have seismic change.
Wonderful. We'll leave it there today. Thank you so much for joining on the show. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad we got to talk about a lot of turkey and a lot of turkey-related stuff.
Thank
and
you.
for anyone who's listening, there's a whole bunch of links that are going to be in this. There's links to the research. There's going to be links to both the farm and Regenefied as well. There's just a whole lot to follow through. So thank you again, guys, for joining. I know we went a bit over, but that's always a sign of a good interview.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. It was a fun discussion.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.